At the very beginning of the framework, there is an explanation about what life is in very broad terms, as in a fundamental sense, rather than the mechanics, the dynamics of life. So a description of life fundamentally. And it goes something like this, that consciousness at rest. So all there is consciousness. This is one of the fundamental pointers in non-dual teachings. And it was one of the key tenets of Ramesh's teaching. And Ramesh's teacher, Nisargadatta Maharaj, also had a teaching that was based on this principle. Maybe the words that are used differently. Maybe awareness is used instead of consciousness in some explanations. But in this teaching, it's all there is consciousness. So consciousness at rest, before manifestation. And even the word before, when we're talking about manifestation and unmanifestation, is not entirely accurate, but we have to work within the limitations of language. So before manifestation, consciousness was at rest. And consciousness at rest is immense creative potentiality. It's not something, it's actually absolute nothing. So consciousness in its unmanifest form. But it's not dead nothing, it's potentiality. God at rest, you could say. But God at rest is pure potentiality. And for something to be potentiality, it means at some point it needs to actualize. And so potentiality at some point bursts into movement, becomes actualized. Consciousness at rest becomes consciousness in movement. Consciousness at rest we can call the unmanifest, and consciousness in movement we can call the manifestation, creation. So the creation is not outside of the Creator. The Creator didn't create a creation. Rather, the Creator has become the creation. Immense creative potentiality explodes into actualization. So God has become the creation. God is not separate from the creation. And God is a word being used here to describe energy or potentiality. And I'm also calling it immense creative potentiality. The nature of this consciousness at rest is immense creative potentiality, which means that consciousness at rest doesn't cognize, doesn't think, what am I going to become? What's a good story? What's a good masterpiece to create? That's how a human, based on their understanding of how life works, which is really based on an understanding from within the manifestation, which really is not a good representation of the nature of what is prior to manifestation. We look at it, when we hear the word God creates, we think of an entity creating. But actually, in this description, source, the unmanifest, is immense creative potentiality, and it actualizes at some point. So it becomes an immensely creative story. It has no other option. If its nature was ordinariness, then when it potential ordinariness, when it manifested, it would manifest into something ordinary. But if we say that its nature is immense creative potentiality, then the movement, which is not something that someone brings about, it's just a happening. That movement creates something infinitely creative, a masterpiece. So if you have a master artist, if fundamentally what they are is a master artist, whatever they create is going to be a masterpiece. If a master artist creates something that isn't a masterpiece, it means that they are not absolutely, fundamentally a master. To the extent that someone is an absolute master artist, whatever that artist creates is going to be a masterpiece. There's no other option. They can't have a bad day and produce something ordinary. I mean, humans can, but if we're using the word they are a master artist in its absolute form, then it's not possible for them to have a bad day. So this is just a metaphor. So consciousness at rest, immense, infinite creative potentiality. So whatever it turns into is a masterpiece. And so we just need to look at life in its intricacies, in the story of evolution, the story of what's happening in life, including, the wars and the conflicts and where they come from and why they happen, and then even the story of industrial revolution, technological revolution, and look at the biology of plants and humans. It's unfathomable, really. And this creation is a creation of duality, meaning the story that has come into existence is a story of duality, a story of interconnected opposites, good and bad, big and small, health and disease, wealth and poverty, male and female. So this is how Ramesh would cover the esoteric explanation of life before going into an examination of the dynamics of the story itself. And if we understand the big picture and then also understand the important mechanics, we end up with a fairly comprehensive understanding that doesn't need to be very complicated. The whole thing can be put forward as a conceptual framework in 2 hours. Actually, someone reminded me yesterday that what Ramesh would sometimes say. He said, I don't know why people keep coming back over and over and over and over again. He said, I suspect you just need to come 3 times, 3 days in a row. The first day, you sit there and you wonder, okay, I wonder what this man is going to say. And so for an hour and a half, more or less, the conceptual framework is put forward in fairly simple, clear, everyday English language, talking about the mechanics of everyday life, which everyone has their own frame of reference for, can understand what is being pointed at intellectually. So day 1, the framework, it doesn't happen like this, does it? It doesn't happen day 1, day 2, day 3. But the reason he used to say it was to make a point. So let me finish what he said. So day 1, you listen to the conceptual framework, you understand it intellectually, and you go home. And you think about it. And inevitably, as you're thinking about it, you're going to have some questions about but actually, how does that tie in with that? I didn't quite get that. So you come back on day 2, and you ask some questions, and Ramesh says, I'd be very happy to answer your questions and put everything in place. And so then you can go home after day 2, re-look at the model with all of your new understandings that came from day 2. You might have 1 or 2 little things still out of place, so come back on day 3 and we'll go through that. And then you understand the model intellectually and you can go away, and as you live life, the intellectual understanding will go deeper and deeper and deeper, because it will have become part of your up-to-date conditioning, and it'll start functioning automatically as life unfolds as described by the concepts. So we'd start seeing, oh yes, the flow of life is pleasure and pain. The pleasure and pain in itself is not an uncomfortableness with oneself. We might notice, but I have an attitude to what is happening in the flow of life. I have a relationship to it. And my attitude to what's happening in the flow of life is one of uncomfortableness. When I sit with it and I feel uncomfortable with myself and with the other, with life. And ultimately that's an uncomfortableness with oneself. So it can click as we're just observing our own life, which is not something we have to sit down and do separately. Just as life is going on, we can't help but notice, according to what the concepts explain, yes, this is how it's happening, and we see it for ourselves. And that's the process of the intellectual understanding going deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. Now, he would say that knowing that even for himself, the process didn't happen with him receiving information in 3 days and then investigating it without returning to the source of that information. Maybe he was saying because you haven't received this framework. The frameworks that we tend to receive tend to be a little bit more complex sometimes, or pointing at the more esoteric side of life that we might not have a frame of reference for. But anyway, I would say even in this framework, it doesn't really happen in 3 days. But what's the point of saying that? The point of saying it is for it to click in our working mind, to click that what is being said is that what's being put forward here is not complex. It's understandable. And it might take more sittings than 3 sittings to actually absorb the whole framework. But if we go in with an attitude to listening to the teachings and we somehow still think that this is complex. So simple and easy are 2 different things. The framework is quite simple. It's not necessary, the simple doesn't mean it's easy to uproot all of the opposite beliefs. It's not really a matter of easy or hard, because what's being pointed at is the fact that life has this. Life has got this. It's not a matter of you working hard and finding it hard or easy. It's life is going to make this unfold. But as part of life bringing about this unfolding, life puts in place the conditioning. And if the entity that is listening, it's not really an entity, if the biological instrument, the human that is listening, receiving the new conditioning, if there are certain conditions already in that instrument, conditions that say, this is complex, it can affect the receptivity of the instrument itself. So this is saying, actually, let's really look at it and hear it for the simplicity that it is. We're looking for human happiness. We don't have human happiness, which is why we tend to seek it. having said that, more and more people, as they seek it, find that they have this happiness more and more. So even when we have more of it than we did before, we still find ourselves moving forward. The process still carries on. So we're looking for human happiness. We don't have absolute human happiness. It's fair to say that by and large, at the beginning of the process and in the middle of the process, we're seeking happiness where it can't be found, looking outward, thinking that happiness is to be found in the flow of life, in circumstance. It's pointed out that our happiness actually is always only attitudinal and not circumstantial, meaning that we're never unhappy because of circumstance. That's what it's really saying. Your unhappiness is never caused by circumstance. Your unhappiness isn't caused because someone that you love dies. Your unhappiness isn't caused because you lose your money, or because a partner doesn't act the way that you've agreed that you should act. Your unhappiness is never caused by outcomes. And I'm sure we're listening to it going, I'm pretty sure I'm unhappy because things don't go my way. And when we look at it closely, it's no, you're not unhappy because things don't go your way, but we end up being unhappy because we have a certain relationship to those things that don't go our way. A certain relationship to the circumstance that turns out of line with what we would like, meaning pain in the moment, not in line with our biological preferences. And so because that attitude is an attitude of attachment to outcome, it absolutely seems that my unhappiness is there because of the circumstance. So there's a correlation, sure, there's a correlation between our unhappiness and circumstance not turning out the way we would like. But the correlation is there because there's a sort of a bridge between our state of happiness and unhappiness, the circumstance, and the bridge is our attitude. And if we don't realize that there is this bridge, which is the attitude, and that the uncomfortable feeling is all on this side of the bridge, on the attitudinal side of the bridge, not on the circumstantial side of the bridge. If that's not realized, we'll continue, not our fault, we're forced to continue to try and change circumstance, try and control circumstance. So we're told, no, our happiness is attitudinal. The attitude that we have, by and large, generally speaking, that life puts in place is an attitude of attachment to outcome, thinking my happiness is found in outcomes, and the idea that the other is the doer and I am the doer. So whenever circumstance is painful, the pain is seen as an attack on who I am, because there's this ingrained belief that says I need it to be pleasurable, and we look at why this pain has come about, and we find a reason why it's there and a reason why it shouldn't be there, and that reason is blame. Either blame for the other or blame towards ourselves. Blame towards ourselves is called guilt. Blame towards the other is hatred or resentment, common blame in its different forms. So that's the attitude that creates an uncomfortableness with oneself. That attitude also includes within it a false idea of who I am. I am something that requires circumstance, requires pain. What if we're not? What if we are not something that is added to or subtracted from by circumstance? If we have an attitude that says my happiness is to be found in circumstance, that really means we have a belief system, a structure, an entity in a sense, an identity that feels very concrete, because beliefs are taken as truth, and the more true you take a concept, and a thought is just a concept, the more true you relate to it, the more dense it becomes, such that it becomes felt that this identity that is really just thoughts flimsy thoughts at their core, the identity feels absolutely real. And when life bumps into it, the reaction is a reaction that's happening to me. It's my reaction, and it feels so heavy and so concentrated, so dense. And the idea that that's a false entity, unless we really start looking at it, unless there's this real resonance inside that says, yes, this is not what I really am. Unless that's there, the thoughts are so concentrated that it feels real. So we really need to be interested to start seeing the possibility that these feelings of who I am are fictitious, based on, when I say fictitious, based on an error, an erroneous set of beliefs that are layered on top of each other. I am this, and I need that, and that, and that, and that, and we have all these needs in relation to this person, and that person, and that person, and that group over there, and the world, and myself. So the beliefs can be, categorized in general terms as an attachment to outcomes and a belief in personal doership. But when we look at it in its myriad of different forms, we see that general set of beliefs exists in thousands, hundreds of thousands of forms about everything that we do in life. And so then we go on, the concept says our unhappiness is attitudinal. The attitude creates this entity that feels attacked by life, feels uncomfortable. It feels uncomfortable not only when there is pain, but even when there is pleasure. When there's pleasure, because pleasure and pain are never actually going to satisfy. Even when there is pleasure for a small period of time, when life conspires, and it will only do it for a short period of time, when things are pleasure, even then we won't feel satisfied. Because that's just a belief of what I need. The fact is that that's not what we are. So we're always going to feel uncomfortable if that belief remains in place, that I am this, never going to be satisfied. So then we describe why the error has been put in place. The error has been put in place not by you or me, but by life as part of this masterpiece of life that is designed to be experienced exactly the way it's experienced. It was created as a masterpiece to be experienced as a masterpiece. So life put in place these errors, sort of God forgetting itself. God, consciousness at source, or consciousness at rest, created a playground where it could do something in the playground that it can't actually really do. It split itself. God can't tear itself up into many little pieces and have an experience of being separate. The nature of God is that it is indivisible. So the best thing is to create an imagination. And in the imagination, the masterpiece of imagination, it creates lots of apparently separate entities. And then it identifies to those separate entities. But what it has to do in those separate entities is create a hypnosis. Has to create some function of forgetting itself. Otherwise, it would create these separate entities, identify with it, but it would know that really it's all me. There isn't really separation. It wouldn't be a very convincing game. So the divine hypnosis is put in place within this creation. The divine hypnosis is the false set of beliefs about who we are. So God, or the source, creation, included the false ideas of who we are in order for God to experience itself as separate, something it can never actually be. See, this is a masterpiece. When you think about it, pretty amazing. And then somewhere along in the game, the hypnosis starts to loosen up. And how the hypnosis loosens up, because this is a masterpiece of cause and effect, a masterpiece of time and space. So fundamentally, when we look at what life is as an experience on a fundamental level, we see that cause and effect are not real, time and space is not real, but from within the story, it's a story of cause and effect, time and space. So how things happen in the story are according to cause and effect. And the spiritual seeking, which is part of the game that God inflicts upon itself, the spiritual seeking is the process by which the divine hypnosis starts to get loosened. And all of the steps along the way have been included as part of the creation. So each seeker, which is God forgetting itself, and then going through a process of remembering itself. So each seeker is taking the steps that are predestined for them to take, and the information that arrives at each point in time is predestined to be there, and it all unfolds as if one thing leads to the other. As if the divine hypnosis gets undone because of all this information that is delivered and all of the contemplating and thinking that the seemingly separate individual seeker does. And then at some point, enough of the error has been undone according to the story, the script, and certain shifts in perception or shifts in attitude. What are often called shifts in consciousness. They're not really, in my way of describing, they're not really shifts in consciousness. What it feels like is that the perspective, it feels like the consciousness has shifted. So it doesn't feel like the mind has changed. This is why we often hear that enlightenment has nothing to do with the intellect. It's a shift in consciousness. That's what it appears to feel like in the story. Really, when you look at it, it's the story having affected the beliefs that keep consciousness in a certain position. Meaning consciousness functioning through a body that includes certain ideas that force consciousness to identify with, let's say, the physical aspects that are very experientially separate from the other physical objects, and to forget the core that's functioning through the human being. So it's a story of duality. This is why good and bad things happen. And so when the question arises, why did God create evil people? Because he created kind people. Because it's a story of duality. In another story, if immense creative potentiality exploded into a different masterpiece, it could be all angels and violins and parties and whatever happens to be. This is a different one. And when it's all said and done, consciousness in movement, which is the manifest, returns to consciousness at rest, and the story is as if it never happened. So in Ramana Maharshi's teaching, you could say one of his ultimate concepts is not to say there is even the unmanifest that becomes the manifest, that's sort of the creation. Unmanifest becoming the manifest is creation. And then unmanifest or manifest returning to the unmanifest is dissolution of creation. Right? So what I just mentioned is that at the end, when the story's all said and done, it collapses back and it's as though nothing ever happened. The Ramana, one of the ultimate concepts in the teaching of Ramana, there is no creation, there is no dissolution, nothing ever happened. So if you start with source at rest, absolute nothing, all of this happens, the whole of time and space, back to source at rest, absolute nothing. So he said, well, nothing ever happened. You know, if something happened, you have nothing, something, and then you'd have to have nothing plus something. But because you have nothing and then nothing, actually all of this must be nothing. How do we reconcile that this is nothing? If we go around saying, oh, this is not real, then you actually end up becoming deluded. You are deluded in the manifestation. You can say it, this is not real, as long as you understand what that means. And understanding what that means, according to what I say, is that we also have to accept it is real. At the same time as saying it's not real, but it is real. It's a paradox. So if you go around spouting one side of the paradox without being aware of the other side and being able to hold it equally so you don't say, it's unreal, oh, but it's real, but so I'm just throwing it in there, but really it's unreal. That's not paradox. Paradox is when it is unreal. You know, this is unreal. This is so real. This is so real. And this is so unreal. That's paradox. Not where you go, this is so unreal. Oh yeah, and it's real, but it's not really real. Paradox is holding the two as if they're not two. So if we can start to comprehend that each moment in life is an experience that is designed to be experienced as this. And it's very clear that this experience right here is an experience that confirms, I use the word loosely, confirms loosely, not absolutely confirm, but it suggests that this is an objective world. And, you know, the greatest of sages, after enlightenment, still didn't allow themselves to be trampled by an elephant, because it's all unreal. So with the deepest of understandings that it's unreal, the sage, and there's a story somewhere in one of the scriptures of a sage that jumped out of the way of an elephant that was ordered to be charged at him. So the king ordered his elephant masters to charge at the sage because they wanted to test something that the sage had said to the king. And the sage jumped out of the way, and the king needed an explanation for this. Why is it that you got out of the way of the elephant if all of this is unreal? And so the sage, went on to explain that this unreal character will get squashed by that unreal character. And so this unreal character will get out of the way of that unreal character. So on the one hand, It's understood that it's not real, but on the other hand, it's also understood it's real. And so, experience, what is experience? We're used to, we'll say experience is experience in the world. We have our experiences in the world. But what if the world is experience? We need to go to the dream at night to show us a different sort of experience. An experience, if now virtual reality, I haven't ever put a virtual reality thing on, but I can imagine how it works. It presents, a world is presented inside the virtual reality system. And the world is a virtual world. It's not objectively real. But it's taken to be real. It's the consciousness that views it identifies with it as real. And so we can see how quickly the consciousness will shift from identifying with one thing as real and very quickly shift and identify with something new as real. So we can be in a virtual world and within a short period of time take that as real and feel like I am functioning in a virtual world. So that's an experience. There's an experience of a virtual world which doesn't seem like a virtual world once it's taken as real. And the night dream is a great example of experience. There is an experience of a world. And within the dream, it feels as real as this. When we look at what the experience is, it's an imagination in consciousness. It's imagination in the mind. Even if we look at it, at the mind of the individual, let's just assume the individual has its own mind, which is what it appears like. The dream is an imagination, a creation in mind. The nature of mind is consciousness. So if something is created in mind, consciousness becomes aware of it. The nature of mind is consciousness or awareness. And whatever is created in mind is not separate from the mind in which it's created. It's intrinsically one with the mind in which it's created. And if mind is consciousness, then what is created in mind, which is not separate from mind, is made of consciousness, is not separate from the consciousness in which it arises and of which it's made, and it's recognized by the very mind or consciousness in which it arises and of which it's made. All there is consciousness. Now, in this example, we're using the human being as the entity, the source, because we're saying a dream arises in the mind of an individual, and we're assuming, for the sake of this explanation, at first we're assuming, okay, the human is a separate entity with its own consciousness. But let's expand our definitions a little bit, and let's maybe think that this mind that we think belongs to the body, what if mind alone, just the consciousness aspect, what if that is what all of this is contained in? So the body actually is just an object in the experience. What if the mind that we get a sense of as being the mind of the body, and we can see it's just consciousness, and there is imagination in consciousness that creates essentially a world made of consciousness, and the identification with that world makes it seem like I am in it. And so we take that consciousness of mind And what if we say, oh, all of this, including the body, and including what I think is the body's individual mind, is all within formless awareness. That would be God. God is formless awareness, like a mind without a body, just mind. And when we're looking at this, one of the interesting analogy, oh no, it's not an analogy, wind and mind. I don't know why this is there. I looked at it once, I'm sure someone else has seen it, and I found it interesting. M-I-N-D, W-I-N-D, flip the M upside down and it's like a W. There's some links there between wind and mind. And wind in movement. What's moving, really? I don't know when there's wind, it's when it's movement. When it stops, there's no wind. Wind and no wind, mind and no mind. Mind in movement, mind creating. So mind imagining within itself, mind and movement. And then mind not moving. It's sort of like wind moving. It sort of can be detected and felt. But then when it stops moving, it's nothing. And I think so. The mind of God is unmanifest, is like wind not in action. And then mind in movement, the whole thing explodes into existence. And maybe it's doing that moment after 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 moment. For all of time. Actually, all of time exists only within the moment it explodes, and then it collapses back to nothing, and then it re-emerges. So if that's happening, and it happens, we are always new. This moment is always new. This moment is all there is. And it collapses back into nothing. And there's no awareness in nothing. The awareness comes in with the moment. And so all we ever know is awareness of the manifest, the creation, the story. And so in this moment, there is included in this moment, there is a notion, an indication in the form of memory of an imagined past, of the Vikings and the Stone Age men and women and the dinosaurs and even an amoeba and even a Big Bang. So in this moment, Roger, the experience, which includes Roger in it, includes objects of thought, right just in this moment, of a past. Not a past that it's experienced, but a past that we've been told existed. This is how, so we're told this is how this is here now because of the evolution. What if this is here because it spontaneously arose in this moment and collapses and then arises again, collapses, arises, collapses. So there is no past, but what arises now suggests there is a past. And we live life, the story of life, is lived as if there is a past and as if there is a future. Even after liberation, there will still be living as if there was a past and as if there is a future. You'll still plan what you're going to do next month and put things in place for what you expect is going to happen next month, knowing that really all there is this, that there is no such thing as next month. And yet in this, as part of the created story, someone says, do you want to do this next month? And you say, that sounds great. Yes, I want to do that, and buy a ticket for whatever is needed. So anyway, somehow we went out of the simple conceptual framework of everyday living, the simple, you can get this in 3 days, and now we're talking about the part of the conceptual framework that says there's consciousness at rest that explodes into manifestation. That's consciousness in movement. That at the point of explosion, the whole of the story of life, from beginning of time to end of time, exists. So you might start to notice that there's a lot of different ways of looking at this. They're not contradictory, just because we say that in one explanation, consciousness at rest explodes into consciousness in movement, and the whole of time, from beginning of it to end, was created in that instant of creation. And what we're now doing is experiencing what has been created. We're experiencing the story moment after moment after moment. It's a framework, it's a concept that is useful at allowing the mind to start contemplating something. And then from a different point of view, we can say that it's not that all of time was brought into existence in an instant, but that there is only the explosion and the dissolution, the explosion and the dissolution, the explosion and the dissolution. And in each moment, the apparent story of time exists. So I'm just throwing these things out there. Don't know why. Why not?
Is it like a movie with frames? In a way, we have impression that movie is continuous, but it's made of, let's say, 640 frames in a second or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very definitely an analogy that can be used. Whether that's really, what creation is, as objects within the creation, we can never know the creation. So what we get given is some insight into it, such that the misunderstanding falls away. And that's enough for the misunderstanding to fall away. And so one of the insights that we get given along the way is, for example, that analogy that allows us to think and go, this, and we think about it, and it opens our thinking up. It allows some of the beliefs to fall away, and then we laugh at the fact that that was an analogy, but that's probably not exactly how the experience of life is. But it's not important anymore to hold on to it. Like, yes, it is like a movie, frame after frame. So I've been saying there's creation and dissolution, and so that is exactly like the analogy of a film, that each moment is independent of the one before and the one after, but in each moment there is the inclusion of an apparent past. So in this frame, there is the acknowledgement of everything that happened in the previous frames. That's exactly what I'm saying. But the reason I'm qualifying it is we also, skillful means and a sharpened intellect at some point even realizes all these analogies, even what I'm giving, are there to help loosen up our misunderstanding. They're not truth. They're accurate descriptions of how life has come to be seen and what life has revealed. But the fact is that when we see life, any sage sees life a particular way, has certain experience, it's not reality. They're being informed as part of the experience. The sage and their experience is experience. So if we realize that all we're ever going to know is experience, that any information we get given, any insight, no matter how profound the insight, no matter how profound the shift in consciousness, let's say, all of that is just shifting experience. It's always just experience. Like in a dream at night, it's always the dream or no dream. So a sage has never experienced reality, never will. Even God hasn't experienced reality. God is mind at rest in this description. Mind at rest, meaning mind not moving, not producing, not functioning, except in its, as mind does when it's resting. And so God doesn't know itself, it's absolute nothing. And then at some point, it creates an experience and it puts sages in there. Or people, and its story is a process where certain illuminations happen. But all of those illuminations are in the experience. They are part of the experience. So no matter what anyone ever tells you, they've never experienced reality. They've only experienced experience that is different to what it was before, and then we can say, oh, now that was illusion and this is reality. That was experience and this is experience. It was just experience that was designed to feel contracted and with suffering, and this is experience that says, oh, now it tells, I know the universe. The universe is now showing me the nature of the universe. But how is it showing you that? It's just a new experience. Is it really truth? But it's sufficient that if it brings about a change, if the changed experience brings about change on certain levels, and the experience then no longer includes suffering, then who cares about whether this is truth or not truth? All we're looking for is experience without suffering. That's what satisfies. When experience without suffering is there, no more seeking. And then who cares about truth? So we say, oh, my seeking for truth was really a seeking for the end of suffering. And the reason why we say I'm seeking for truth is because in the story we can say that suffering is based on a lie, a mistake of who we are. And so if we have a lie in place, if life has put a lie in place and it's described like that, and we see at some point all of the functioning of how we function in life, and we can see that there's images that we put forward to people in order for them to look at us a certain way. We try to hide things, and we realize at some point, I'm just lying. I'm sick of putting forward an image. So on many different levels, we get the message that what you want is just to allow everything to be as it is. And so we see, I want to see everything as it is. I'm looking for truth. And so in that case, truth is really the end of the false idea of who I am. And the false idea of who I am is largely put in place because life is seen as an objective reality. And then what I am is seen as an objective part of that objective reality. I am the body, and I need the body to be certain things to delivered to the body, pleasure, 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 instead of pain, pain, pain. And so on the whole thing goes. And from that perspective, there's a lot of suffering. So we say, I'm looking for truth, but really we're looking for the end of that mistake of who we are. Really we're looking for the end of suffering. And the good news is that even though it's all experience, and there is no truth, ultimately there is no truth, we get it's available, what we're looking for, the end of suffering is available. And when that's available, we go, actually, who cares about truth? I thought I was looking for truth. Actually, I was just looking for the end of suffering. You can fight him for it if you want.
then we can say that in the same time God appear in me and die in me, like as I experience, like the life. It's totally the same, or yeah.
I think so.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
So dying to each moment
Yeah.
refers to this. It refers to a realization that all there is this, and the next moment is fresh. And so we die to each moment with each moment, and we're born afresh in each moment. This is attitudinally, experientially, we don't ever feel the dissolving and the re-emerging. Maybe there never was, maybe there was just one, this one, and in this one emergence, you see our head starts to have trouble getting itself around this, because we're talking about the absence of time and space here. And all we ever really know in the creation is time and space. So to imagine this, so that's why the analogies are useful. To use an analogy which creates a contrast from what we're useful, but still within some sort of understanding the brain can have. The concepts are very useful. And then we do come to know these things in a way that is undescribable, but my point is, even what we think we know, what life has, not knowledge, the old sort of knowledge, but even, I'm talking about the insights, the knowing that is put forward in wisdom teachings. Pick the most profound wisdom teaching, and what I'm suggesting is that is a knowing that life has delivered to that individual as part of the experience of life, and it's just experience. Can it ever be truth? If experience is relative. Experience, in the analogy where Ramana said actually nothing ever happened, he's really saying that the creation is all experience. That's why it can be called nothing, because at the intrinsically, experience is empty. The nature of consciousness is emptiness. And so can there be any truth delivered in experience? It's enough truth to bring about the end of suffering. That's good enough. I shouldn't have started off with the simple 3-day thing, because we've just to clarify, this is turning into an esoteric exploration into the fundamental nature of consciousness and experience. No longer an explanation of practical daily living and suffering in daily living. However, having said that, these explorations do provide a lot of foundation for a dissolving of the beliefs that exist in practical daily living.
Don't worry, if we if we would like to give up, we would do it earlier. You said that who cares about truth, and we all seek for happiness. And everything is experience, and actually there is no truth. Okay, but didn't we speak about, let's say, one true place or sense or whatever, the sense of existence, or which is not. Which is undeniable, or which is unchangeable, or whatever.
So what you're referring to is where I would say that everything in life is a concept or transitory, coming and going. Perception, so all of these things are relative. And then I would say in the teaching, the only truth in the manifestation is the impersonal sense of I am.
Yes, but not just you.
For everyone.
All.
It's pointing at, no, we only know the impersonal sense of I am that exists in our experience. So what it's saying is that really when you listen to that, why is that statement made? The only truth in the manifestation is the impersonal sense of I am. This is so amongst all of the concepts that are being put forward. We say, everything I say is a concept, not the truth. That doesn't mean discard them, like, oh, they're not true, throw them out. No, treat them for what they are, pointers, concepts, that can be very useful to allow the mind to see something within this manifestation, see something that it didn't see before. So very useful. But then it's making it clear they're just concepts. Don't take them on as new beliefs. It says the only truth in the manifestation is the impersonal sense of I am. Now that statement is really important. If we think about it, we say, oh, so what it's saying is that everything is just pointing at that. All of the concepts are really pointing at the one truth. That's the realization. The sense of I am is intrinsic. It's one of the two basic aspects of consciousness. And sometimes we even bundle them together because they're not two. So the basic aspects of consciousness is the sense of existence, the sense of I am, and the function of awareness. So if they're not two, we can just call awareness and being I am. And so the only truth in the manifestation is the impersonal sense of I am. Now, the wording is interesting. It's particular. The only truth in the manifestation, which means whenever the manifestation is present, which means your experience, that's the manifestation, it's saying that I am and awareness are always there. They're the one things that are not there. Other things are there or they're not there. The table is sometimes there, sometimes not. The mugs and the other people, and even our body, sometimes there and not there. In meditation, the body is not there. When you're really present with the experience of meditation, the body is not there. What is there? Awareness and the sense of existence. And funnily enough, the awareness and the sense of existence, because it is always there, is overlooked. It's treated as, it fades into the background because it's always there. So, and then on the other hand, I'm saying there is no truth. And so you're saying, but didn't you say the only truth in the manifestation is the impersonal sense of I am? And what I really mean is there's no truth, no absolute truth. So in the manifestation, yes, let's say awareness and the impersonal sense of I am. But what about in the unmanifest? The concept I put forward is in the unmanifest, even awareness and the sense of existence collapse with the manifestation. So in the unmanifest, no I am, no awareness, except in its potential form. Which is like wind in its resting form, no wind. So then how can we call I am and awareness truth if they're not there? But in the manifestation, they're there. And why is it important to know I am as truth in the manifestation? Simply because we're looking for happiness in the manifestation. Happiness as Milosh or as Roger. And so to find the truth in the manifestation, good enough. But at some point we have to realize, but this is experience. That's part of coming to truly truly know the fundamental nature of life, fundamental nature of experience, is to know it is experience. And to know that even I am is experience, and awareness is experience. In non-experience, the absence of experience, even those are not there.
Yeah. But how do we know?
Yes,
because we are not there.
We're not there. No, we come to know not in a way that can convince anyone, really. But the answer is, this is the simple answer, I have come to know the experience as experience. So know this fully. And the unmanifest, which is where experience springs from, which means that the unmanifest and manifest are not two. They're intrinsically one. Unmanifest becomes manifest, manifest goes back to unmanifest, unmanifest becomes manifest, they're not separate. If we come to know the manifest, that's enough. And we can then know certain things. If we know the manifest as intrinsically not separate, that awareness and the experience are not separate. So most Advaita teachers will be pointing at that, the non-separateness of awareness and the experience or the content. So really, it's saying that when we say there is a field of awareness and content, it creates a conceptual separation. Then there's a correction to that usually, and says, but actually they're not two. That there is, we're creating a conceptual separation just to create a split so that it can be recognized. But then we realize, the awareness and the content are not two, which really means we have to break the idea that there is a background of awareness. If the idea there's a background of awareness collapses, if it's seen to be a concept that was useful at some point, and then we see there is no background. It's not that the content is always changing and the background remains the same. That's in contradiction to there is no separation between the awareness and the content of awareness. They're inseparably one. So if we say there's a background, we're forgetting they're inseparably one. If they're inseparably one and content changes, really means that in each moment content collapses and then re-emerges as new content. Collapses, that's what changes in this context. And so if the awareness and the content are not two, a progression of the idea that awareness is ever present, a progression of that is, awareness collapses with the content. It has to, because they're not two. Awareness and the content are not two. So it collapses. It doesn't remain, and the content collapses, and then the content re-emerges. But even this I don't hold it as a belief.
When you say non-manifest, you also put deep sleep there. Or?
In the non, well, if we want to be, it's a bit tricky. In the absolute non-manifest, you would say even the absence of deep sleep. It depends how you look at it. If you look at the waking state as manifestation and then deep sleep as the whole manifestation collapsing and awareness falling away in deep sleep, there's no awareness, yes, you can say that that's the unmanifest. But if you look at the waking state, dream state, and deep sleep state, all as states within the manifestation, then the unmanifest is even prior to deep sleep. So it just depends on what your definition of deep sleep is, as to whether the unmanifest is the equivalent of deep sleep or the unmanifest is even before deep sleep. But so as not to go into this topic too deeply, because we can get lost in this and forget about practical daily living. It's relevant to the extent that we awaken to the truth in the manifestation awakened to manifestation as an experience, if it happens to be our path to go through this sort of more esoteric exploration, but not to remain thinking that the manifestation is truth, not to remain thinking that awareness, which is there in the manifestation, is some absolute. Because often in the teachings, it needs to just treat awareness as the absolute. That's enough. Let's treat awareness as the absolute so that there can be a movement and an awakening to awareness. At some point, even that stepping stone that has been created needs to be shown as having been a limited stepping stone, and the absolute is the absence of even awareness. The complete absence of everything. So that just needs to be seen. We'll never experience that absolute nothing. God itself can't experience absolute nothing because of its nature as being the absence of even awareness. It's good enough to just recognize, of course, this is the manifest. Prior to the manifest is the unmanifest. That's it. Now once that's done, no point in having philosophical debates about it. There's just enough to say, okay, but now I live in the manifest. I'm never going to live in the unmanifest. The universe, the world, is not the unmanifest, it's the manifest. So we come to know the manifest. There's just a little extra. Oh, remember, the manifest is not separate from the unmanifest. There is the absence of the manifest. And you click, oh, yeah, that's so poetic. But now let's live in the manifest. Important.
So you said that thoughts are intensive emotions, or emotions generally, I didn't understand, are actually thoughts, no? So if you can explain this a little bit. You explained something, but it's generally all the emotions are actually thoughts, or...
So usually when I use the word thought a lot, thinking, thought, beliefs, right? And the general definition that is applied to thoughts and beliefs are that they are something in the head, and that they are sort of two-dimensional. And when we talk about feelings and emotions, the general definition and understanding, experiential understanding, is that feelings and emotion are not at all like thoughts. They're not two-dimensional, like we think of thoughts as intellectual and flat, and so feelings and emotions, we think they're like three-dimensional or five-dimensional, whatever. We can feel them. And often when I talk about beliefs and thoughts, I'm not just talking about them in the conscious mind. They're actually stored in, it seems that this is what life demonstrates to us, that thoughts are stored in the body. And thought is energetic. Even the ones that are in our head, they're energetic. But because they're on that level of the head, the energy is being dissipated as the thoughts come and go in the level of the head. When the thought is suppressed in life and locked away as part of a trauma, so trauma is really trauma is an event, but the trauma is not the event itself. The trauma is the relationship to the event. The trauma is really the story that got put in place about me and what this event was in relation to me. And in that story, there is the guilt, the blame, the hatred, the fear, the worry, the anxiety, and the expectation and attachment to outcome. So that basic belief system, the identity, has been attacked by life. It's exploded into action as an uncomfortableness in that situation. So historic situations we're sort of talking about here, where there was deep grief or deep resentment, deep hatred, deep shame, based on outcomes, circumstance being extremely painful, not in line with our expectations. And so that whole relationship to the circumstance is uncomfortable, and it's not usually able to be processed in line with understanding of non-doership. So because it doesn't ever get to be processed, because to process something you need to see it as it really is. So because this is all an error of oneself, essentially, it doesn't get processed, and so it feels extremely uncomfortable, and the body figures out the best way to deal with it. And that is to suppress it. And because this attitude, which is really all thoughts, is all energy, that when it's suppressed, it's an energetic load in the body. And what happens then is life comes along, it triggers these energies, and we experience them as emotions and feelings. And so when we experience them as emotions and feelings, if someone says that's a thought, sometimes we have no frame of reference as to how can this be a thought? This is not a thought, this is a feeling. Because the language we have is there's feelings and there's thoughts. What I'm suggesting is that a thought is, or a feeling, is a condensed set of, is a story being triggered, and then it comes into the body as feeling. And why does it come in as feeling or emotion? Because thought is energetic. And so when we feel emotions and feelings, we can say, yes, this is energetic. But we don't have that relationship to thoughts. We don't look at thoughts as being energetic. They don't feel energetic. They are, it's just that they get to go through quickly enough. When they're suppressed, that's a lot of energy that doesn't get released. And so it keeps coming up into the body as fear, as anxiety, as depression, as despair. Or when someone doesn't do something, it comes up as hatred. And you know that feeling when someone does something you don't like, the blame comes up. It's not your doing. This is what non-doership points at. It's like you didn't stop and think, I'm going to feel this way. It just comes up. And you can feel it. It's a charge. So that's what I was pointing at. Feelings, at the bottom of a feeling, there is thought or a belief. And we can see this by, if we dive into a feeling, really dive into a feeling means we don't push the feeling away and we just let it get bigger and bigger and bigger until it's got big enough that we can just explode. And so you're in a safe place, in a room on your own, it gets bigger and bigger, and then you just allow the words to come out and you allow the body to move. So, there's various practices where you can hit pillows and whatever. And when that happens and you start hitting the pillows, imagine if you have a tape recorder or a video recorder going of what you're doing, what you're saying. Just a tape recorder actually is better, or a voice recorder. And afterwards you press, play, and you listen to what is coming out. And one, you can feel the energy coming out, not necessarily on the voice recorder, but well, you could, if you're sensitive to energy and you listen to it, you can feel the energy in the recording. But the person themselves can feel this is an energetic release, all energy. And then when you hear the words, there's a story there about an event that happened. And the story is, I hate you for what you did to me. I hate you with all of my being for what you did that was an attack on who I am. Or the story can be, I hate myself, I'm so full of shame for how I acted in that situation. Or grief, I'm so grief-stricken by what has happened here, by what you did or what I did. And so when we listen to the story, we realize, this feeling is actually a story. A story means beliefs about what happened and what it meant to me. And when we look at it even closer, belief is thought.
And what about sadness as a biological response. So it's difference between grief and sadness. It's a
Yeah, great. Yes. So when attachment to outcome has fallen away, attachment means the ingrained belief that my completeness, my happiness is to be found in outcomes. So we are attached to outcomes, which means there is going to be a sense that my completeness and the outcome are linked. And that's an attachment, which means we're going to insist that those preferences are delivered when attachment is there. So when something tragic happens in the flow of life, that's pain. It's an outcome. And the attachment to outcomes means that when there is pain, it is received as an attack on the level of who I am. And that turns into grief. So if someone we love dies, that's pain in the moment. And we can call that pain in the moment, when it's just pain in the moment, sadness. It's not what we would like, and because the situation is sad, we feel sadness. When the attachment is there, that sadness suddenly turns into a sense of loss, like I have lost part of who I am because the other person is no longer here. And there's grief in that, and there's a bitterness to it. It's an uncomfortableness with oneself. We really feel like we have lost part of ourselves. If that attachment isn't there, it makes sense that when a sage meaning, a liberated person, and one of the biggest forms of non-liberation is attachment to outcome. So when a sage who doesn't have attachment to outcome hears news about his mother or father dying or a close friend dying, if the mind expects if the mind thinks that equanimity means that the sage is going to go, oh, who cares? Who cares? It's the same as if someone came and told me that the mailman just came. That's not equanimity. Equanimity is always on an attitudinal level. On a biological level, on the flow of life level, there is preference. For a sage has preferences. He sees certain circumstances not the same as other circumstances. Fundamentally maybe the same, like right down at the bottom, the same. That's where the equanimity is. He sees all circumstance as either pleasure or pain, something in the flow of life. But on a higher up level, the flow of life is differentiated. And so getting that news is very different to getting news that says, you are now being given a new ashram, let's say, right? That's a sage that in the old days, when they're in ashrams, they get given news versus your best friend has died. And so a sage can feel sad and can even cry, but that sadness is not a bitterness. It's actually based on love. So the sadness is based on an appreciation for what was there, the relationship that was there, that was very beautiful, pleasure in the moment, and it's now gone, and so there is a sadness, but the loss is interpreted very different. It's not a loss on the level of self. And so it doesn't even get looked at as a loss, it just looks like the end of something beautiful. Not loss. And so the sadness is actually an appreciation for the beautiful thing that was there. And then once that sadness has been felt, for however long it's destined to be felt, without it being an interruption in one's connection to self, then life carries on. So I'm sure many of us have heard the story of Ramana. He received news that a childhood friend had died. A tear came to his eye. So he had biological sadness. His internal equanimity, according to this concept of what this change is all about, his internal equanimity would have remained unaffected. So he remained connected to himself, knowing that even in the face of tragic circumstance, he is complete. sadness nonetheless in the form of a tear came to his eye, and then he clapped his hand and said, lunchtime. That's it. Sadness arises and it subsides. And later on in the evening, a memory might come to him about his friend and himself. And sadness may arise again for a period of time, but definitely not in the form of grief, not in the form where there is an uncomfortableness with oneself. Once again, I would say the sadness that arises, the base of a biological sadness is love. The base of grief, which is on the psychological level of self, is bitterness and the sense of loss. And anger, now we're talking about, because it's a very subtle point, which is very important. Anger compared to blame. We might sometimes think that this understanding, where there is no attachment to outcomes, means that anger will no longer arise. It's a misunderstanding in the same way as thinking that sadness won't arise because two situations are considered the same, whereas in fact they're very different on a situational level. Anger is an appropriate biological response in relation to a certain situation. And different people, based on their genes and up-to-date conditioning, their preferences, and how their body makeup is made up, because on a genetic level it can determine whether you are more angry, prone to anger or not. So some people will react to a situation angrily, biologically, and others won't. If you take two sages, they will take Ramana, let's say, who tended to get less angry. He still got angry, but less angry. Take Nisargadatta Maharaj, apparently, used to get angry regularly. Assume they are both liberated sages, and they both had different temperaments. So in a situation, take this, a sage who's living in modern daily life, parks his car at the shopping center to go and do his grocery shopping. Brand new car, bought it a week ago. Comes out with his trolley and walks around to go to the boot, and a truck, not a small truck but a big truck, has smashed into the car, the side of the car, and it's all squashed in. Not just one panel, but the whole, all panels on one side. And can't even open the door. Right? So at the time when he comes around and looks at his car, right, with the trolley, you expect, not expect, it's normal. This is how life works. You see something, you hear something, you taste something, you touch something, and a reaction happens. Right? Now, so when that happens, and you see this, a reaction is going to happen. Now, it might be shock, which we don't call anger, which isn't anger. Let's say it's like, right? He might turn around and laugh, or he might come around and go, "Fuck." The last one we can say is closer to anger, right? But at the same, that's just the reaction to seeing the thing. If there is blame, which means I don't understand, how this has happened. Life has stopped working in this moment. Like, this is life not working. This is the universe broken. Right? This circumstance is an attack on who I am. Right? That's very different to the anger that can arise in the moment, and then it's blame and insecurity and uncomfortableness with oneself. So in another example, if someone's a sage standing close to the edge of a cliff, let's say, and someone comes running around playing soccer or whatever, and at some point you see they're not aware of you and the cliff, and they're running towards you, chasing the ball, and they're probably going to bump into you. Or, so equanimity is on a attitudinal level, not a biological level. And so, people who are trying to be equanimitous on a biological level, thinking, I'm trying to be enlightened. that's unenlightenment, because there's a controlling of circumstance, trying to control circumstance. Allow circumstance will be, and so even when I say a controlling of circumstance, there isn't anyone in that position trying to control circumstance. It's just misunderstanding, part of their genes and up-to-date conditioning, creating a belief that I need to be equanimitous on a biological level. So this is why we hear that this understanding isn't going to make you a perfect human being. This understanding isn't going to change some of your biological shortcomings. You can see that if your genes are such that you're prone to get irritable, you can acknowledge that's one of my shortcomings. People do some things and I tend to get irritable quickly. And just objectively, if that was the case, you could look at it and go, look, who am I kidding? If I had patience, that would be far more preferable than if I have a tendency to be irritable. So we could look at that and assess it objectively and say, yes, this is a shortcoming of mine. I tend to get irritable rather than be patient. And this understanding, which is really an understanding that allows the body and the flow of life to be exactly as it is, isn't going to magically fix a genetic tendency towards irritability. It's not going to prevent us from getting biologically angry. And in fact, in some cases, biological anger is the most appropriate action as a form of protecting the biological. If you're near a cliff, someone's coming, and they push you off the cliff, and you die in equanimity, it's a shame, really. So it's like the sage getting out of the way of the elephant. Biologically, there will be a movement towards pleasure and a movement away from pain. And that movement towards pleasure is always going to be there, even when the attachment to outcome has fallen away. And similarly, the biological reaction is always going to be there. Sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. So anger, we can say, is a biological movement that is painful for both the person getting angry and painful for the person receiving the anger. But for the one getting angry, it's pain that arises and subsides, and no horizontal blame for oneself or towards the other for making you angry.
Thank you for explaining that, because there's so much really trash in these images, how the awakened person or whatever should look like, act like. I mean, it's 25 years of my life listening to some concepts, so thank you really for this.
Yeah. This is the difference between attitudinal and biological. The attitude of equanimity allows the biological to be whatever it is. Really what that means is the attitude that is not attached to outcome understands that the flow of life is going to unfold as destined, is going to be pleasure sometimes and pain at others. It understands that the biology of the human, both oneself and the other, is part of the flow of life, and it's not my doing. The anger is part of the genes and up-to-date conditioning. And the anger of the other, part of their genes and up-to-date conditioning. And it's understood that that anger is not an attack on who I am. And so attitude is equanimitous to whatever happens in the flow of life, which will always be duality. And as soon as we try to say, I shouldn't be getting angry, I should be acting a certain way, then that's the attitude trying to control the genes and up-to-date conditioning, trying to control the biology, and at some point we realize this doesn't work. There's an explosion. The biology has to act the way it's designed. Oh, just for the recording.
So we could say the freedom is also to experience fear, anger.
To experience?
to experience all kind of emotions, also those negative emotions.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, freedom from resistance to certain emotions arising. Yeah, I agree. Also, to make it clear when what happiness we're talking about, and to show how radically different it is from the normal understanding that my happiness is to be found in circumstance. This is talking about a happiness that is available even if we find ourselves wrongly convicted for a crime we didn't commit, put into prison for our whole life, a prison, hard labor maybe, where there's nothing nice about this prison. All of that is circumstance. What this is saying is that our happiness is available even in that situation if our attitude is such that the attitude of doership and attachment to outcome, which is basically the false idea of who we are, has fallen away. Then in any circumstance, our happiness is available. Now clearly that means not happiness in the form of excitement and joy or great food and pleasure. It means a happiness which is continuous, unbroken peace of mind, even in the face of pleasure and pain. So that peace of mind doesn't feel like something. It's not something extra. It's simply that we find ourselves going along our day, even in a very restricted situation where we have very few freedoms on a biological level, and yet we are free on an attitudinal level. Free because there is the understanding that if this is happening, it is the creation. It's happening because it couldn't have happened anyway, any other way. So all of the thoughts that have an imagination of how life could have been different, that person shouldn't have framed me in this way, and that the people, the inmates, shouldn't be acting the way they act, and the guards shouldn't be acting the way they act. I shouldn't be in here. All of that, which is so understandable, all of that thinking is so understandable if we look at life a certain way. But if life has brought about these changes, it can become clear that what I am at my core is untouched by this circumstance. That's the key to it, is to know that what I am at my core is untouched by circumstance. If it happened to be that, well, it's just as it is, and it's extremely painful, that to me wouldn't allow the equanimity to be there. If what we happen to be at our core was something different from what it is, if what we really are is something that is attacked by circumstance, then just seeing it to be as it is isn't going to be enough. It would mean that happiness in that situation wouldn't be available, because we are something that is attacked by circumstance. That's if we happen to be something that's attacked by circumstance. But it just so happens that what we are at our core is there in any circumstance. And it's there in its completeness. And that's why equanimity and peace is available to those people who are in very unfortunate circumstances, disabled, for example, those people that find themselves in history, plenty of accounts of people in concentration camps or other such places that have come to this freedom. And one of the nicest, talking about people imprisoned, one of the nicest things that I read in the last few years was when Nelson Mandela was released from prison, and as he was walking through the gates, I believe he stopped and looked at the gates and told his friends and maybe the reporters, he said, I've been imprisoned in this prison for 25 years. And if I walk through these gates and I hold on to resentment and hatred for those people that put me in here, I'm still imprisoned. So what that is showing is that his imprisonment is not the imprisonment of a cell. What it's demonstrating is that he realized this a long time ago in prison and was free in prison. Free from the hatred and resentment and blame and maybe even shame. He might have had shame for doing with a different attitude. He could have had shame for standing up for what he believed, and guilt. And he could have imagined, had thoughts about my family and what I've put them through, and felt very guilty. My interpretation of this is that Nelson Mandela's attitude was an attitude free of the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome, which allowed his true nature to be front and foremost, even in prison, which is probably why he ended up having good relations with everyone around him. And he was demonstrating this wisdom in a place, as he was walking through the prison gates. And so very much in the same way, if we are in resistance to our certain emotions, then that same lack of freedom exists. Yeah. So to see even blame and hatred, if it arises, it's a happening, not our doing. It's happening based on the genes and up-to-date conditioning that the divine hypnosis has put in place in order for that to happen. So it has to happen in that moment. We're not creating it. And so when anger arises, which is a biological reaction, or when blame arises, which is a psychological reaction, the distinction between the two is not to say, one is acceptable and the other is unacceptable. It's just a distinction that says one is biological and it's not suffering. The other is suffering, an uncomfortableness with oneself. What we're looking for, this is just a description, what we're looking for is the end of suffering, the end of an uncomfortable. It's not saying what we're looking for is the end of suffering, you are doing the suffering, so stop doing suffering. It's just a description that says what we're looking for is the end of suffering, not telling anyone to do anything about it. So one of the deep realizations is that when suffering arises, that too is a happening and not my doing, and it has its place. To the extent we think it shouldn't be here, what I'm looking for is the end of suffering. So this suffering is an attack on who I am. I don't want it to be here. I feel guilty for suffering. I feel blame towards the other that is making me suffer. All of that is a whole lot more suffering.
Also, the suffering is part of it. Also, the suffering is not something that has no place in life. It's
exactly,
part
yeah.
of life.
Yeah, so yesterday I mentioned it, I think, in the morning satsang. The definition, there's the flow of life, in this set of teachings, in this framework, there is the flow of life, and the flow of life refers to just the biological reactions, the pleasure and pain in the flow of life. So it doesn't include suffering in the definition of flow of life. However, in life overall includes the flow of life and our attitude to the flow of life. And so the blame and the suffering is the attitude towards the flow of life. So life itself includes both the flow of life and the suffering. And there is a place for both the flow of life and the suffering in life overall. Neither of them are our doing. They are all components of life. And so to the extent we see that life is an experience, meaning an experience of lots of different colors, if we want to say that, and black or gray are valid colors on the palette of colors. And so suffering is a valid component of life. Still, we have to see it as an uncomfortableness. To see, yes, suffering is an uncomfortableness, and what I'm really seeking is the end of uncomfortableness. That's very useful. As soon as it turns into something that we insist on, as soon as we insist on it, then what's going to happen? We're going to resist suffering as inappropriate. It's a very good point.
Yes, since we were talking about emotions, would you like to explain, let's say, how to deal with negative, or let's say negative emotions? You said that they are stored somewhere in the body, like suppressed thoughts, and they have a lot of energy inside, and they are somewhere in the system and, let's say, blocks some part of the system.
Okay, so one of the keys that life needs to deliver. So life delivers new conditioning, and that new conditioning can become part of our up-to-date conditioning. So the teachings are new conditioning. And so when one of the keys to actually these energies coming out, which is what happens somewhere in the process. So I don't generally talk about this as a practice. It'll happen at a certain point in time. It's good to know it will happen, and it's good to hear about it. And the hearing about it can unlock some of the things that are preventing it from happening. So to understand that when it happened, it was in relation to an event, a circumstance, and it was an attitude to that circumstance based on the deeply ingrained false idea of who we are. And so that when a deeply painful situation happens and there is a false idea of who we are, there is going to be immense uncomfortableness with oneself and with the other. And so that uncomfortableness is exactly that, an uncomfortableness with oneself, which is going to be there wherever we go. So we need to do something about it. The body says, this is not acceptable. Let me do something about it. And so biologically, the body finds the best way it can to deal with it. And the best that it has available to it, by and large, is to suppress these feelings, to find a place where the intensity is less. And that seems to be, that it seems to find spaces in the body, in between muscles, and so these are a bit of stories here, but you know, sometimes we can see that by massaging a certain pain, suddenly an energy goes through the body. So we can draw some conclusions that at least within this story of life, there's this correlation included as part of the story of life. It's not necessarily absolutely true, but it seems observable. So the energy finds its ways into hiding spots. Big muscles are a good place for it. That's why we tend to get a lot of back pain, lower back pain, our thighs. And it's sort of acceptable when it's over there, because what happens is a sort of radiation of that energy comes out, and we feel that, but we feel the sort of the external, the outer edges of that radiation. And so we feel an uncomfortableness, but it's nowhere near the intensity it was when it was right on the surface, when all that energy was right on the surface. So we learn to live with it. And the other effect of having these false beliefs of who we are locked away in the body is that we go through life and we tend to see life through that lens. So what's locked away in the body is an idea of who we are and an idea of the other and what they can do to me to help me or to hurt me, to add to me or to take away from me. And so we tend to live with a certain pattern recurring. Not accidentally, but because our makeup, our belief of who we are and how we see life and how we see the other is through a consistent lens. And that lens, it's not only a lens, but it's also an energy, because what's locked away is an energy. And so other people have energies, and certain energies are attracted, or certain behaviors are attracted by certain behaviors, or repulsed by certain energies and certain behaviors. And so it's no surprise that people find themselves repeating patterns over and over and over again. The story of life is a story designed to unfold according to apparent cause and effect. So if it puts in a certain energy that attracts another energy that has been put in place, the cause is having a particular energy, the effect is another energy is attracted. And so time and time again, the same energies come together, and just like two chemicals that come together, they react a certain way, and the outcome is consistent. So the patterns end up manifesting in the same outcome. So you can have certain relationships between two types of energies. The behavior in the relationship is consistent, and the outcome is consistent. So these are the reasons why it's useful for these suppressed energies, which the body thought was a good way of dealing with them. It turns out really not a good way of dealing with it, but the best it had available to it at the time. It turns out not a good way of dealing with it, and the answer is for these energies to come out and be released. To put it in context of the talks, the energy is the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome. And so the energy coming up and being released is the uprooting of the deeply ingrained beliefs of personal doership and attachment to outcome. And how the energies start coming up is when certain concepts are introduced, concepts that are contrary or contrast the existing beliefs in this energy. When they come in, they start to shake up the environment. They're sort of like soldiers that come in and have fights with the opposite beliefs. And when there's no other opposing soldiers, the army is at rest and everything's fine. When an opposing soldier comes in, which is the opposing concept to the ingrained belief, they have a battle, and we feel a battle going on. Everything starts getting stirred up. And if it's destined for that stirring up to turn into something positive, then that will happen. If not, then the person will probably move away and find some distraction technique, the old distraction technique, to get rid of this uncomfortable feeling. So in this environment, the explanation is that it's worthwhile coming to understand what these feelings are at their root. So it's worthwhile coming to understand the story, the beliefs, the thoughts that are at the bottom of these feelings that we start feeling, this uncomfortable feeling. And it's coming up because we could call the energy locked away in big muscles, we could call that the subconscious or the unconscious. And when these other concepts come in, they start stirring it all up, like mud in a jar. And so the mud starts coming up to the surface where we can feel it. And there's two options. Life can unfold where we say, this is so uncomfortable, let me find a distraction. Or life can unfold where it says, no, I understand that feeling this is going to reveal more of the beliefs of attachment and personal doership that are contained in the body. It's going to allow an understanding of where the suffering comes from and what beliefs it's attached to. And if feeling it turns out to release the energy, meaning it gets expressed, there's a difference between it just being expressed and it being released. So anyone could come in touch with these emotions and express them. If someone's understanding is such still of doership and attachment to outcome, and they come in touch with these feelings and they express them, the only option is for them to remember, based on the expression, remember the situation, feel how hurt they were, probably take it with the same attitude of doership and attachment to outcomes, and actually the load can get even bigger rather than being released. So expression doesn't necessarily mean release. However, if the person who finds expression happening happens to also have been reconditioned by life in such a way that now life is being seen in a far less personal way, it's starting to be seen that whatever the other does is based on their genes and up-to-date conditioning, part of the creation of life, part of the story of life. And that what the other does that hurts me is at worst pain and at best pleasure. And so on a present day experience, we're finding that the uncomfortableness is getting cut off much quicker, because there's an understanding that, oh, this is doership. This uncomfortableness is blaming the other, thinking that they're the doer, but actually I understand they're not. And so the thought can automatically arise, the other is not the doer. My happiness is not to be found in pleasure and pain, and what he's delivering or she's delivering is just pain. And it can allow us to drop and stop. Stop really means the story that was going on about hating them, it's like stop. And so if that's what is now happening in someone's life, because on a intellectual and a deepening level, there is an understanding of non-doership. When we come in contact with these ingrained emotions, which is not something we do, we just wake up one morning and it feels really heavy, and we might find ourselves curling up in a ball and allowing the energy to get stronger and stronger. And if that happens, we can start to feel it, and as it gets more and more defined, we might need to put some words on it to get it more defined, like throw words that we suspect may be related to the theme of that feeling. So abandonment, grief, hatred, not being understood, all sorts of words that we come to understand are at the core of our particular blueprint, which we can see as we start to observe our feelings more and more. So we put words onto it, and the feeling can at some point develop such that we start to feel that it's about a particular person, and maybe about a particular way that they treat us, or the way that they acted, or the way we acted in a certain situation. And at some point, it becomes so clear it's about that, and it only becomes clear once the words start coming out, and the tears start happening, or whatever, the shouting. And when that's happening, there's deep hatred, or deep grief, or deep shame in that emotion. And we might have the thought that comes up, oh, I can't express this. This is very unenlightened. It's what Vladimir was pointing at, is that we might have a resistance to certain emotions being there. And that's not healthy. That's still doership, sort of trying to decide what is allowed in the space. And so the idea that it's very unenlightened gets in the way of this process. So to allow that complete unenlightened energy to come out, the hatred and the blame, and understand that what's coming out is an energy that was locked away, suppressed, in relation to an event that happened 30 years ago, when life had delivered genes and up-to-date conditioning that had no other option but to see life through the eyes of doership and attachment to outcome. So then these energies are allowed to come up as, in a sense, an object. This energy is just an object, not who I am, an object that's been locked away as a result of life unfolding a particular way. And it's really impersonal. In fact, it can be amazing to see how intense these energies can be. If you find yourself crying or whatever, and you happen to look at yourself in the mirror, sometimes you can be shocked at what emotions are there, because the intensity of this. But if something is understanding, this is just energy of doership, which is a false idea of who I am, a false idea of the circumstance, a false idea of the situation, without demeaning it, without reducing it down to, so we're not suppressing it anymore, we're honoring it, allowing it to be as it is. It comes out, and if that happens, then the current understanding of non-doership is transmuting it by not getting attached to it. And it's finally getting processed the way it wasn't able to be processed. Because it wasn't able to be processed before, it was locked away in the body. Now it's being processed. And that means that load is no longer in the body. It doesn't mean that because something is processed that magically tomorrow we're going to not feel certain contractions and resistances and feelings of uncomfortableness. But theoretically, if something's come out, the load in the body is less. And then if it happens again, it's less again. And I'd also like to make the point that this is not about having to express all of the energy in the body. It could simply be about creating enough space in the body for some more insight to happen, because these energies tend to take up space, awareness space. And so it might just be about releasing enough for awareness to see more clearly. It might be about releasing so that it becomes really clear based on our own experience how much of this doership belief is actually locked away, and so we can start ticking it off from our own experience of locked away energies. Yes, there is the belief in doership, which is arising in this energy. I saw it in the form of hatred. Or yes, there is attachment to outcomes, and in this particular case, attachment to love. Love is a pleasure that we are extremely attached to, thinking ultimately love is what's going to complete us. And we see, yes, this was non-love being delivered to me, and an extreme resistance to non-love being delivered, an aversion to it. And it was locked away in this energy. And so that can be a reason why this needs to come out. And at some point when the understanding is really clear on what all the misunderstanding is, then the understanding, without all the energy needing to be released, will undo the knot on a level of principle, and we'll find the whole load of guilt and blame will fall away without needing to express all of the events that have happened in our life, which if we needed to do that, it's like uprooting just too many things. There'll always be something else to uproot. So at some point it will cut it off in principle, and all the energy will fall away. And to make the mistake of hearing that and think one day I'm just going to feel this whole load fall away, we might not even know when it falls away. So this liberation, contrary to what we tend to assume, can be so subtle, not necessarily subtle the process, we know the process is happening, but when does it end? Does it really have this very defined line in the sand? It could well be that we find ourselves living life, going through life, and at some point we realize, oh, actually, I've been living life for the last 6 months or 3 weeks or 6 weeks or whatever. Life, pleasure and pain. It's not that life magically was pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. life was still painful at times, and yet I look back and I haven't found myself suffering. I haven't found myself in resistance. I haven't found myself blaming or feeling guilt or continuously obsessing about how the future is going to look. And we might say, actually, maybe it's happened. And so if we do that after 3 days, it might be a bit premature. But if we look back and we think, actually, for the last 6 months, it hasn't happened. Maybe it's happened. And then another 6 months go past and no suffering arises. And then we realize, we look back and we go, well, it seems that 10 years go past and no suffering has arisen. So we go, well, can't ever be absolutely sure. Who knows? Maybe someday it will happen. But in those 10 years, there were probably quite a few very significant events that happened and no suffering. And so for all intents and purposes, you say, well, it's happened. The end of suffering is here. And you look back and you go, I don't really know when it happened, sort of in that 6-month period. Somewhere along the line it happened. It's, is it necessarily this light bolt down from heaven? And who cares? I mean, the ego or the doer might want it to be some big event. That's the ego that is looking for, that's the doership that is looking for some sort of specialness, for some sort of outcome. And at the end, when it's happened, you go, who cares that I don't know when it happened? All that's important is that there's no suffering. That's all I was ever really looking for. We know that that's what we're looking for, not because we set it up as an idea, that's what I'm looking for, but because in practice, when suffering stops, when suffering's not there, it's the only time in life that seeking stops. So the conclusion can be, if seeking stops when suffering stops, all I'm really looking for is the end of suffering. Not as some hypothetical, but as an actual inference based on experience.
Thank you.
Thank you.